Bonjour.
Hello, good afternoon, welcome.
It's my honor to welcome David Fricker, the Director General of the National Archives of Australia, to the Wallot-Sylvestre seminar series today. The last speaker I introduced was David Ferriero, the National Archivist of the United States. So, contrary to popular belief, you don't have to be called David to be invited to give this lecture, and you don't even have to be a National Archivist. As a matter of fact, our next speaker in October is a librarian, and he's called Bob. Going back to David Ferriero, he coined a phrase when he said that instead of talking about backlogs, we should be talking about hidden collections. And he might well have been referring to a certain Australian playbill which made big news for LAC back in 2007. So let me tell you the story. One of our rare book librarians, Elaine Hogue, was going through a scrapbook given to LAC by the Library of Parliament. Imagine her surprise when she discovered a playbill for a performance of Jane Shore to be held at the Théâtre Royal in Sydney, Australia, on the 30th of July, 1796. That's right, 1796. The small printed paper she had stumbled upon in a scrapbook turned out to be the oldest surviving document printed in Australia. Realizing the historical significance of the playbill, LAC returned it to the people of Australia in the spirit of international cooperation and a shared recognition of the value that both our nations place on preserving our national documentary heritage. It's now in the safe hands of the National Librarian. Quite a story. And one that illustrates the long and convivial relationship between our two countries. David Fricker brings with him a vast range of experience drawn from the public and private sectors, giving him a unique perspective on the work done by public archives. David joins a growing list of distinguished speakers invited to participate in the Wallot-Sylvestre seminar series.
This series was created in honor of Jean-Pierre Wallot, the 6th National Archivist of Canada, and Guy Sylvestre, our 2nd National Librarian. Their work is highlighted in these seminars, and we hope that we will be able to take this opportunity to expand the ways we think strategically about information sciences, archival sciences, history, and all related fields. Jean-Pierre Wallot and I were colleagues at the University of Montreal in the late 70s. Following his quite remarkable academic career, Jean-Pierre was appointed as what was then called Dominion Archivist of Canada in 1985.
Described by one historian as an archival giant, Dr. Wallot is best known for his work in developing the National Archives Act and the building of the Preservation Center. He also made great strides towards the management of electronic records and Canada's audiovisual heritage. Joseph Jean-Guy Sylvestre was appointed as Canada's National Librarian in 1968. His dream was the creation of a decentralized network of Canadian libraries supported by the National Library. To this end, he worked on the creation of bibliographic standards for the Union Catalog and for library systems throughout Canada. He also expanded the National Library's collection during the 70s and early 80s to such an extent that by the end of his tenure, the library was a major national cultural institution with rich and diverse collections of Canadiana, social sciences, and the humanities.
The work of these two important individuals brought international attention to Canada's way of approaching our collections and preservation, and of providing services to clients. Their work continues to have a major impact on us today and on the work we do.
To present our speaker, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Leslie Weir, the University Librarian at the University of Ottawa. Leslie.
Thank you very much, Guy. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker for the Wallot-Sylvestre seminar, Mr. David Fricker, Director General of the National Archives of Australia.
I am also very pleased to see so many people here today. Without a doubt, this will be a fascinating seminar on e-government and policy responses from the National Archives of Australia. But first, a few words about David.
After completing a BA in Computer Studies, David began his public service career in 1979 with the Australian Customs Service. During this time, he held many positions with Customs, which included the challenge of managing major innovative border management projects for passenger processing and cargo control. In 1987, he moved to the private sector, joining Computer Sciences Corporation as a senior consultant and accountant manager, where he worked with several different government departments. In 1993, David founded Business Synthetics, a consultancy company specializing in strategic planning, information systems architecture, business process improvement services to a broad range of Australian government agencies. In 2002, he left his consulting practice to join the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation at a time when it was embarking upon a period of extraordinary growth and change. For 5 years, he held the position of the Chief Information Officer, driving innovation in technical infrastructure, analytical capability, and digital information management. Then it was in 2007 that he was appointed to the position of Deputy Director General, when he managed a program of change across the human capital framework, intelligence and information policy, legislative reform, and protective security policy. It was January 2012 when he assumed the position of Director General of the National Archives of Australia. During his tenure, David's strategic focus has been the whole of government transition to digital records and information management, the expansion of preservation capability for paper and audiovisual as well as digital records, the acceleration of declassification of sensitive archival documents, and the exploitation of emerging technology to enhance the public's access to archival resources.
Despite his busy schedule in Australia, his country of birth, David has also been very active internationally. Since 2012, David has been an active member of the International Council on Archives, becoming president of its Forum des Archivistes Nationaux in 2013. In recognition of his vast knowledge and extensive experience, David was recently named as president of the International Council on Archives. And now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming the Director General of the National Archives of Australia, Mr. David Fricker.
Well, thank you very much, Leslie, for that introduction. Although over lunch today, Leslie had promised me that she was going to have you on your feet cheering and doing Mexican waves and somersaults. So, yes, I barely recognised that person you were talking about, but I think it's a very good introduction, so I'm very pleased. Thank you. And it looks like my presentation is too big, even for this. Thank you for that. I apologise. I'm experimenting with this Prezi presentation software. So look, my talk today is on the topic of e-government, and in particular what it means for the archival sector. What are the policy responses that we need to formulate to get on board and get ahead of the curve as there's a general transition around the world, but especially in Australia, in my case, towards e-government. And so what I wanted to do today was perhaps reflect first on why it should matter so much to us as archivists, and then talk about why the challenges are there, what sort of responses are required, and then I just spell out the policy measures that we have adopted in Australia to adequately respond to those challenges. as we once again wrestle with my incompatible Australian technology. But look, I will start screaming along here. So first of all, if I do talk about why it should matter to archives and archivists in particular, should I advance the slides while we do this, just in case? This is the other thing that could go wrong. If I hit this green button, either we'll get the next screen up on the screen there, or that part of the room will explode in the wall. Place your bets. This could be the highlight of the afternoon, right? Whoa! Very good. Very good.
Bottom right. Tell them the bottom right. Tell them to hit the bottom right.
No, that makes it too big, the bottom right. Okay, that's good. Well, why don't we move to there? Thank you. That's great. So in terms of why it should matter to archives and archivists in particular, the role of the archivist, the enduring role of the archivist, is of course to keep memory, to bring the past into the present, to make sure that as a nation, as a society, as a community, we don't forget that we have access to the memory that makes us who we are today, that informs our decisions about the future. And the way archivists do this, of course, is to select those records, those very few records that merit permanent preservation and access into the future. And so in this respect, our role has never been a neutral role. It's never been an objective role that is subjective. It's a non-neutral role. Because when we're selecting those few memories that are to be preserved, what of course we're also doing is selecting the memories that will be lost. We're determining what should be remembered, but also we're determining what will be forgotten. And I think that's a mighty responsibility on the archivist, and it's something that I know, and particularly here, I think has attracted quite a bit of analysis over within the profession and from outside the profession, in terms of postmodern appraisal of records, if you like, and the subjective role that the archives play into the future. Now, in the case of, so that's by way of saying that we do need to constantly reinvestigate and revisit the work we do and why we do it. Now, as government archivists, and in the case of myself as the National Archivist for Australia, for the Government of Australia, what I'm trying to do is preserve the essential records of Australia and Australian democracy. And so what I need to do is to make sure that we have adequately kept a record of those activities and those decisions of the Australian government that makes it accountable to the people of Australia and indeed to the world for now and in perpetuity. And so that is a weighty responsibility upon everyone. It means that we have to be thinking always of the future, we have to be predicting the future, anticipating the future, and making sure our policies of today are reflecting the needs not of today or yesterday, not upholding necessarily or preserving traditional practice, but we're thinking about what society will demand of us 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, 5,000 years from now. So it's a big call to make. And that's why with the advent of e-government, we do need to be now thinking about, well, what should a National Archive do? What are our policies that we should be having in place to make sure that there is an adequate record for the future generations, in my case of Australia, but indeed of the world. And so if we talk about e-government, first of all, and what it is and why it's a game changer, in my view, in terms of the work we do, and then I might try and break that down to sort of pinpoint some of the policy challenges that it presents us. So here we go. Wow. E-government, I can't find an authoritative definition of e-government anyway, so I've come up with one myself that I subscribe to, and I implore upon each of you to adopt it from this moment on. Because it is a little bit ambiguous, a bit vague. But e-government essentially is the movement of using digital processing platforms to facilitate those interactions between citizens and the government, including businesses and other institutions and the government. And so straight away you're going to see a bit of a theme of mine here. It's expressed in terms of technology. Okay, so it's e-government more often than not is presented as an application of technology, and I'll keep returning to that theme. But it's supported in the Australian case with a number of quite specifically articulated policies of the government to do a few things which are listed up there. So it's about the digital economy. It's about rethinking the economy of the nation, understanding that a nation will be enriched both in terms of cultural life, in terms of prosperity, and in terms of rights and entitlements if we embrace the digital economy. So that means changes all around. It means government should be delivering services online. which brings with it all sorts of things in terms of location, in terms of timeliness, and in terms of information accessibility. It's also about getting public sector data out there into the public, so making it available to fuel the economy, the digital economy. And of course, it's about a process of change across government to make sure that we're breaking down all of those silos and the duplication and fragmentation which exists across government agencies in the application of information and communications technology. So these are the aspects that are most often put forward when governments, in particular commentators, talk about e-government. So let's sort of have a look at a few of these things and why that stuff, which is very process-centric, which is very sort of dynamic, it's all in the moment, but why archives and why archivists should be concerned about this and what role we have to play. The first one is what I observe to be an accelerated democracy. That now there is a growing pace of movement in public opinion. There's a growing, the speed at which any social issue can gather momentum and become a national issue and sway public opinion is vastly accelerated. Social media, of course, is the platform of choice to make sure that these views, the views of a minority, whether they're authentic views, whether they're evidence-based or not, but these views are expressed very quickly, propagated very quickly on social media. Major contributor is right here before us now with Mr. Bertillon, who's so heavily active on the Twitterverse. I'm just overwhelmed with the tweets that I'm seeing. And so, what this means is that this is the go-to place now for development of social thought and development of policy opinions and these sorts of things is the Twitterverse, is the blogosphere, is the social media world. And that has had a result because people expect that pace to be maintained across all aspects of their political discourse. There was a review, a think tank in Australia, the Lowy Institute, a very reputable, really great institution in Australia, does an annual survey. And one of the things they survey are attitudes towards democracy. And one frightening result that they came up with was that in Australia at least 60% of Australians at voting age, when asked is democracy the preferred method of government, only 60% would say that democracy is the preferable method of government in Australia. Now, thankfully, the poll didn't sort of suggest alternative models. It would have ended up with 40% of Australians want a totalitarian regime. So happily they left it there. But they're very telling that if 40% of Australian of voting age, if 40% of Australians are not prepared just to say as a matter of course, as I would, well, democracy is the preferred method of government, it means that they are getting disenfranchised with democracy, that they're becoming disconnected from the traditional institutions of democracy. That is, once upon a time, if you expressed your anger in something, you might write a letter to the editor of the paper, you might write a letter to the government department, you might write a letter to a local member, and expect some sort of an argument or a discussion there. Now, you bypass all of that, you send out quite an inflammatory tweet or whatever, you gather momentum, you pick the right hashtag, and off we go. It's all happening. And then the news media, 24/7 news cycle, will pick that up, it becomes a news item, it gathers more currency, and it sways government opinion. And because it sways government, or because public opinion sways government thinking, then governments now, in the e-government region, governments have to be a part of this discussion. They have to be a part of this discourse. They have to be on that evening news. They have to have the 10-second news bite ready, or they have to tweet as well and provide responses to this. And so for us as record keepers, as records managers, for us as the standard setters across government information management and record keeping, it means that we have to really think about, well, what are we doing to ensure that there is evidence-based answers available in these rapid timeframes, and that the responses are factual and that they are authentic. So that's a big issue for records management across government. There's also the open government movement and the open government partnership. Now, in the Australian case, the Australian government is considering its formal signing up to the Open Government Partnership, but it is under consideration, and certainly it is government policy to have some of the open government attributes picked up. And the main one there, at the top of the list there, is that government, this basic recognition that government information is public information. So the information of the government belongs to the people that elected that government. It's a fundamental foundation of democratic values. It also means that there's got to be more public participation in the development of public policy, which means if you're going to have evidence-based, informed policy development, government information has to be out there. It means dealing with the escalation of FOI requests. The more you give out, the more people want. Obviously, we're all, it's human nature. And so there are a huge escalation in Australia of freedom of information requests or the right to information requests that occur. And the other thing about open government in Australia has been quite a specific part of the digital economy policy, which is saying that government assets, digital assets, information assets of the government have got to be driving the digital economy. And so information is there not only to inform us about specific issues or inform us about historical fact in Australian history, but collections of data have to be available at the disposal of the digital economy to drive the prosperity of the nation. So again, for us as record keepers, as records managers, we have to be thinking about, are we creating government data? Are we creating government records ready, fit for purpose, to be driving the digital economy? And again, big issue, we've got to come up with responses on that. And the slide there is you, in the Canadian system, you have many hundreds of thousands of data sets. I think I was hearing yesterday up on the data.gov portal. In Australia, we're dragging the chain a little bit. We've got 5,000, I think it says there on the slide. But these data sets are being put up all the time as assets to feed some sort of analysis or some sort of startup, app developer that might be able to grab it. But what isn't really happening at the moment is that these things are being put up as quite temporary. They have quite they're perishable, these data sets. After 5 years, it's doubtful whether they will be that useful. Another piece of the new policy platform is digital by default, and here I mean the digital delivery of services. It's now become policy as part of the government framework that any transaction which occurs more than 50,000 times a year, so you think of tax returns, you think of social welfare, over-the-counter inquiries, any of those transactions, the most common transactions of the government, have to be delivered by digital channels. Not exclusively, but they must be available as a digital channel. Now that, of course, means mobilising the records and the data behind that service to be digital ready. It has to be there, ready to provide and fuel that service of government service. So again, it behoves us all to make sure that the records are digital ready. In Australia, there's been establishment of the Government Digital Transformation Office, recognising that this is a whole-of-government shift, a major transitional shift in the operation and the functioning structures of government and how we work. So there is a very large coordinated effort to change it all. And also that the idea of it is that it's become a citizen-centric. So the citizen wanting a government service shouldn't have to know how government is structured. They shouldn't have to stand in several different queues to obtain a particular service. They should be able to come to one point, deal with one government, and have their service delivered. And so this has become the Tell Us Once policy in Australia, which I think Australia borrowed from the UK. And it's becoming more and more available to a single MyGov portal where you do go and request your service or to offer new information, etc. And again, this idea about this Tell Us Once approach, about one citizen dealing with one government, when historically our records management across government has been each department, each section, even teams within departments, building their records management regimes and keeping their file plans and all of their records management regimes quite native to that organisation, and not going to work if we're dealing with a whole-of-government approach. So we need to be thinking about that. Along with that Tell Us Once approach is an interesting tension around privacy. And so if someone in this Australian system goes to MyGov, that one government portal, and says, okay, I want to tell the government I've changed my address, but I don't want the tax office to know. I just want the social welfare people to know I've changed my address, but don't tell the tax office. And we have said, fine, we can do that because it's privacy, isn't it? It's all about maintaining privacy. Now, I'm being flippant, but don't get me wrong, I do respect privacy. I promise. Very important. But just from a technical records management point of view, it presents quite a a challenge, I think, because even though I know that the government makes records about me, they are government records, but I find myself instinctively referring to them as my records because it's about me and therefore it belongs to me. You know, the government's holding my records, the doctor's holding my records, you know, the tax office is holding my records. And so we feel, because it's personal information about us, then we have some ownership over it. And again, as government service delivery and to respect privacy, we do provide that service. We allow citizens to have much more say in how the records about them are being managed, who gets access to that record and when that record should be merged with another record, etc. And so what we are looking at now is one government, but operating one records management system with several different compartments through it. And so it's this compartmentalisation of a common records management system which poses particular challenges for us if we're going to move the whole of government into the e-government regime. So privacy is, and will continue to be, one of the information policy challenges for as long as I'm in business anyway. And after that, they can have my records. I'm okay. The authenticity this is something else which is going to be challenged more and more. So as we move into the digital regime, as government records are held up to scrutiny, the authenticity is going to be challenged for those records unless we have absolute proof that we know who the creator of the record is. We know that all of the handling of that record, like a chain of evidence, you know, a custody of evidence type thing, that we know that there has been no unauthorised or undetected tampering or alteration of that record. And also that, and this is a really important part as well, with digital record keeping, it can become quite fragmented, quite opportunistic. There's a bit in your inbox, there's a bit in your shared drive, there's a bit in the database, and you might put something in the EDRMS, you know, at the end of every Friday sort of thing. But when you've got a discovery order on you, when you need to produce electronic records, it has to be produced in full context, and particularly to make sure that you haven't omitted something which is just as important as the record you thought you were looking for. So the exculpatory information, for example. So not only information that proves this happened, but you also get the information that might prove a different version of events as well. And this issue of authenticity, not only of an individual record, but authenticity of the aggregate, authenticity of the font, I suppose, ultimately, is going to become a big issue in terms of managing electronic records across government. And look, and obviously I can't not talk about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity has ascended as the highest priority for governments around the world. The world spins on information. You know, the people are enriched. People understand themselves, their identity, where they come from, what nation they belong to, how I'm going to vote, how I'm going to send, where will I send my kids to school, what bus should I catch, what car should I buy. All of this is driven now by the availability and access to information. And of course, national security, depends on it. Economic prosperity, our freedoms, our entitlements depend on information security. So in a digital world, with so much information being thrown around in digital environments, in various neglected environments and in compartments around the place, we do have to worry about information theft, criminal activity, which is grabbing information for purposes of extortion or for commercial advantage or for whatever reason. State-based espionage, of course, is a high-order priority for every country in the world, and I mean every country in the world, not just the developed world. Hacktivism, the threat of just vandalism to destroy records which are necessary for the delivery, sustained delivery of critical public services, and of course cyber terrorism as well. These are often talked about at different conferences, altogether. So there will be a cyber security, information security conference, which is quite different to a records management or archives conference, but the two are interlinked. We really do, as keepers of the record and keepers of memory, we have to understand cyber security, and we have to understand the consequences of allowing vulnerabilities in digital records to endure. And of course, in the digital world, the three V's, the volume, the velocity and the variety, we are gathering up huge volumes of records at a phenomenal rate, and this will only get bigger. And the variety, of course, is that there are complex digital objects being collected as records. So they're not static two-dimensional documents in electronic form. It's more than just a PDF. What we're talking about here are executables. What we're talking about are macros embedded within spreadsheets. So we're talking about records that have to be performed, they have to be re-performed, recomputed to deliver the information to the person accessing that record. And so that variety of proprietary and non-proprietary formats of records is also something which is crucially important for us as records managers and archivists to understand the proper context, the proper preservation and the proper stewardship of those records. And the good news, I suppose, is that in the digital world, as opposed to the paper world, it's actually very difficult not to create a record. If you do anything at the moment, well, you're going to create a record. I'm here today and I'm creating a record, because this will be recorded, it'll be registered, it'll be streamed over the net. I'm sure it'll be on CNN tonight, it'll be Star every journalism award in the country. But so the good news, as I say, is that we not so much dealing with what if people don't make a record, but what we're dealing with instead is the fourth V, which is the vulnerability. And there's a lot in the news at the moment, from south of the border, from here, in terms of records, official records that are being created, but on non-official platforms, for example. Now, I do it. I use Gmail sometimes to send emails, and you can edit that out of the video. But I'm quite conscious that when I need to make a record, when I need to keep a record. But for convenience sake, if I need something, a copy of a record on my iPad, for example, to go off to a meeting, I'll mail it to myself and I'll Gmail it to myself. But more and more governments are using Twitter to make official announcements. Governments are using websites, of course, for official business of that government agency. We use voicemail often. And these things operate on independent platforms. These are on non-government platforms. They're not the property of the government. They're the property of Facebook, or they're the property of Twitter, or they're the property of Google, etc., or the telco. And internally, within organisations, we create records in our email, we leave records in our inbox, we have records floating around on shared drives, posted up on our intranets, etc. And these are records which are left in unregulated, uncontrolled environments. And they also become very vulnerable. So in the paper world, you could rely on an agency collecting its records, operating a registry, and then comes time for transfer, maybe 15 years later, and the box of papers is there. You put it in a truck and it's brought to the archives and deposited, job done. But that's not the case in digital. So, paper is very patient, paper is very perseverant. It'll sit there dutifully, obediently for 1,000 years. Digital won't wait 5 minutes. Once you've received an email, what happens in the next 5 minutes can often determine whether it'll live forever or it'll just be completely lost. And letting alone the other vulnerabilities that I mentioned too about stuff lying around in unregulated areas which are susceptible to theft, espionage, cyber attacks, etc. So vulnerability is very important, and it's not. I picked a picture there of the old Tandy, Radio Shack computer. Of course, we're all familiar with obsolete platforms, but vulnerability is also just digital left unattended will fade and be lost. So we need to respond to that. And this brings me to technical obsolescence and information obsolescence. One thing that we have to deal with here is that most of our colleagues in the civil service, most of our colleagues in most organisations use technology to do things more quickly, to get more things done in a day, or otherwise, to have more fun. It's about convenience, it's about sort of working in the moment. And too often, the process, getting the work done, finding those savings, finding those productivity, is valued much more highly than the information is created. So we don't see ourselves as knowledge workers. We don't see our value as the knowledge that we have created, which is available downstream to other, processes. But it's about, the workload that we've completed today. My intro was this big in the morning, and now it's down to here, job done, give me a pay rise. And so this is a very process-centric behaviour, and it does come back to so much of e-government being focused on technology and not so much about information assets. And so we are dealing with this, with the policies that we're developing around this process-centric behaviour, that most work of government is done on very process-centric behaviour. So it's about getting the job done quickly, it's focusing on a single transaction, it grows a very narrow concept of responsibility for many public servants, civil servants, and it leads to secrecy and an accent on security. So it's not about information sharing, it's not about knowledge creation and knowledge management, it's about process. Whereas we know, this is the terrible irony here, we all know that the technology we're using today we will not be using, probably even 5 years from now, let alone 10 years from now. But we also know that the information we're creating today will be absolutely used. It'll be delivering benefits and dividends for many, many years to come. And everyone knows that. We all understand that every time you read a book, every time we look at any sort of history or look at any sort of archival resource, we understand that. But in our day-to-day work, we just don't work that way. And so we need to be thinking about technical obsolescence as being something which is really good, and information obsolescence which is not so good. And if we instead move to an infocentric behaviour, so away from process-centric to infocentric, then what we are doing is saying, look, the value you have as a member of this knowledge-based organisation, the value you have is the information you create. That you are valued on the assets that you are creating, which provides better decision-making and ultimately a better prosperity and better access to justice for every citizen. And so we need to instill across the civil service this idea that there's a long-term view of the true value of information. So creating efficiencies for downstream activities, but also just sending that message that technical obsolescence, which we all complain about, I think you got some new Blackberries the other day, and I'm sure that's giving you a headache, but technical obsolescence is good, okay? It might hurt at first, but actually you like it, it's fun. And technical obsolescence is a sign of progress, it's a sign of advancement, it's a sign of reinvention, it's great. Information obsolescence, though, if those systems are being replaced, and then you're stuck with this awful data migration project, and you end up losing half of the information instead of carrying it across, information obsolescence is regressive. Information obsolescence takes us backwards. Information obsolescence is a sign of a dumb organisation, not a clever organisation. And it's this message. Technical obsolescence good, information obsolescence bad, which has to be pushed through our policy platforms to make sure that all of our activities are creating records for the future. And so the messages there are that all of our records are being talked about as digital assets for a digital economy, big message we keep driving. And also that the digital records that we create are the intellectual property of the nation. So it has this value associated with it. It's not just to get you through the job you're doing today, but this is the intellectual property of the nation. And it's the cultural heritage of the people. So these values that we assign to every single record that we create, we're trying to instill into sort of a cultural change across the Australian public service. So let me talk then about our policy response. So what are we doing about achieving all of these things? What are we doing about avoiding information obsolescence, about achieving those cultural changes across the public service, civil service, and what are we doing about avoiding information obsolescence while encouraging technical obsolescence? And this is based on these infocentricity, if I can use that word, aspects of our policy are contained in these aspects of our policy. Now, broadly, this is badged as Digital Continuity 2020. So what we've done is set a set of targets for the year 2020 across Australian government. And so we've adopted these targets to say by the year 2020, certain things will have happened and will be embedded across every activity of government. And it's based upon, I'll just briefly talk about, it's based upon our digital transition policy, which set a target for this year. And the digital transition policy was simply that any records which are born digital need to be kept as digital. It's a very simple policy. Born digital, it stays digital. And if it needs to be preserved by the archives, then it comes to us as digital. Simple. But it doesn't mean you're allowed to print things off for record-keeping purposes and then 15 years later scan them back in again and send us the digitized. That doesn't do it, and that's cheating. And I'll find out, I'll hunt you down, and I'll punish you. So that's what digital transition is all about. And it's recognising that, I'm talking about born digital records here. So by the end of this year, that was our target. All government agencies of the Commonwealth Government of Australia had to achieve this target. Whereas right now, at this stage of the year 2015, we're about 80% there, and I'm really working very hard on the last 20% of agencies to get us across the line. It remains our target, and it will continue to be our target, because I've already told my government that in the year 2016, if we're not doing this, if we're not managing digital records digitally, then we are losing them. They're just gone. And the Australian government is spreading amnesia because it's unable to implement this transition. So there's a real risk, and it's, in fact, I'm saying it's gone beyond risk. I can almost would find it very easy to produce evidence that we are losing our memory as a nation, and it's just unacceptable. So that's the target by the end of 2015. Now, of course, we've got a bit of work to do within the archives. We have to be digital archives, of course, to make sure that when that stuff arrives, we have digitised all our internal processes. But that's a topic of another presentation. Requires a bit more humility on my part, so I'll skip that altogether and just talk about what everyone else has to do. All right, so building on that policy, the digital transition policy, well, what then? So that's when each agency has got its digital transition worked out, signed up to digital records management, but what are we doing about all of these other challenges of e-government that I just went through? The first one there is ISO 16175. Anyone familiar with ISO 16175? You can spell it, you can enumerate that. Okay, it started as an ICA REC, it started as an ICA standard, it was adopted by ISO, but it's Principles of Electronic Record Keeping Systems, international standard. And what we're saying is that every system, not only your EDRMS, but every IT system which is an operation in a government agency must fulfil the requirements of ISO 16175. It means it's a record-keeping system. So it might be your decision support system, it might be your enterprise database system, it could be your email system. But if you're running it, it has to comply with these requirements. Now, at first, I get howls of protest from the CIO community in particular, saying, thanks, there's one more IT project we've got to take on, and that's another additional set of features we have to bolt onto every procurement that we make. But in fact, if you drill down on it, it's quite self-evident. All it's saying is, if you are running a government software system, it has these features built into it. It will make sure that there is no unauthorised alteration of any data in there. And in fact, it will make sure that it recognises the data that it holds as records, it will recognise those as records. So it's simple. There's no unauthorised alteration. There's no unauthorised access. Tick, tick. Those should be evident in every system. But here's the information obsolescence thing. It's got to be ready to import records. That has to come out of the box. Don't try and bolt that on when you're doing the end-of-life project. That has to be there at the beginning of life. And also, it has to be ready to export those records, to transfer them to the next version of software, or otherwise transfer them to the archives. These things must be present. And within each of those are some requisite metadata requirements to manage the ongoing management, intellectual management of the record, as well as the identification and discovery of those records, etc. So there's a bit behind those, but at the highest level, nobody could possibly argue with any of those things, and yet they're not present in some of the most important IT systems the government departments around the world are using, delivering critical public services. Those simple features are not present. So by 2020, they have to be there. And that's around creating records and preserving records, protecting them, mitigating those vulnerabilities I talked about earlier, and protecting them from information obsolescence to make sure that systems come and go. But as Shirley Bassey famously said, data is forever. And so I think she said that. So it's making sure that we don't fall into that information obsolescence trap. Simple. Well, I think it's simple anyway. The other one, the next one on there is digital workflows. It's very common practice for, because I say born digital must be kept digital. And then a simple little loophole here is some clever manager somewhere in the organisation will request a record to be printed off so that he or she can sign it. This is my approval, this is my thing. So signatures are still so prevalent as a method of recording a decision. And that becomes a probative record. You need that record to demonstrate. Every court in the land will recognise that that's an authentic record. So we've got to stop that. It's unnecessary. We don't need wedding signatures anymore. We can use digital workflow systems to make sure that we record decisions electronically. They are defensible, inviolate records of decision. We're not introducing analogue records into an otherwise digital chain of records. We're avoiding those wedding signatures, and also we are then maintaining that context. The all-important context of the record is being maintained from end to end with that macro transaction, that whole transaction. So that's another thing. Now today's technology will do that. There are all sorts of ways that certified software systems can record a decision. And in practice, most court cases, civil cases, they end up receiving emails as evidence or text messages as evidence. So the court processes are okay with this. It's just our own mindset that requires this, because we love the feel of, a pen in our hands, and we love the flourish of our signature and all the rest of it. But we've got to get over that and go digital. So that's part of our digital continuity. And the last one there, if you're feeling motion sickness, I won't zoom in on this one, that just sort of explains itself. But the interoperability there. So, as I said, the digital transition means each agency is controlling its records digitally, maintaining, from cradle to grave records digitally. But the whole of government, remember I was saying we need a one records management regime across government, managing the several compartments of government, keeping records about, the same citizen. So not only does that data have to be kept in digital format, but it has to be interoperable. So you need to create the record in the first place in a form and a format which is compatible with every other government record that's being created. And not only have you got to do that, you also have to create the metadata in the same way. So the data itself is usable, reusable and shareable, because with the standards-based approach to creating those records, and it's discoverable across the whole layer of government now and into the future, and it can be managed by subsequent records management systems, archival management systems, because of the standards built into the metadata. So data, metadata, interoperability standards are also part of that policy. I just want to trip on this for 1 second. I mentioned earlier in my introductory remarks that the work of the archivist is about what do we forget as well as what do we keep. And it's with the digital age, we can't keep everything. We hear ourselves say that all the time. We can't keep everything. The volume of data is too great. The volume of information is too great. But we also have to recognise that out there it is being kept. There's no end in sight for Google or Facebook or whatever. They'll just keep growing. So the common Joe on the street will sort of say, well, why are you telling me you're running out of storage? I can store everything I want. It's cheap. Storage is so cheap. And so I do think we have to come up with a better argument than we're running out of space to store this stuff, because as technology increases, so does our capacity to store. But what's important, of course, is access. What's important is how useful is that collection. And as we appraise records, and as we think about the future digital economy, and as we think about society of the future being this hyper-connected, information-hungry society in a world-wide hyper-connected society, we have to be taking a broader view about the records we are appraising as possessing enduring value. There's an argument that's going on in Australia at the moment is around the census mainly as a budget measure, but also as a performance measure. We have a census, a national census every 5 years, but people are starting to ask, well, why? It's very expensive, and this information is being collected in all sorts of transactions every day of every week. Why do we need to collect it again through a very expensive census collection process? And if we were doing our appraisal of government records with the economic dividend, with a national dividend in mind, then I think we should be appraising administrative data. So if a social security department is doing over-the-counter transactions, they're collecting information about that particular transaction, which may or might not have any archival value in long term, but they're also collecting information about the income, the address, how many cars do you drive, how many children do you have, how old was your relative when he or she died. There's all sorts of stuff which is being picked up incidental to that, and this is enormously valuable demographic information. And so, we might be thinking about using our appraisal techniques to think about there's a possibility of a continuous census here, that demographic data that governments need to govern a nation might actually be much more available, readily available, much more cheaply through good records management and archival work. Now I'm kind of making this up as I'm going along here, I don't mind telling you. The ink is still wet on this slide, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. What memory are we preserving for the future? What will the future need? As opposed to what the past has taught us will be necessary. And in terms of the volume of data that we're keeping, we of course need to be thinking about cloud technology. We need to be very aggressively exploring new technology, massive storage capacities, and thinking laterally about how we might plug into those technologies, how we might use them, but also think about distributed custody. That in the digital world, we don't have to hold it in a repository. We don't have to own it, on our property and keep it there. It could be kept as in distributed custody arrangements. They're still archival records. They belong to the nation. They belong to the archives. But if they're held, and we know that they're being held to our standards, they can be held over there. And so they're sort of getting us to challenge our preconceptions about appraisal, and we are reviewing our appraisal policies, our macro appraisal policies, to include not only records that protect rights and entitlements, that record major government activities, but also will deliver economic benefit. And I was really pleased before coming here and checking the website of LAC that this is written into the legislation here. That one of the purposes expressed in your legislation is that it is to, I can't remember, get the words wrong, but it's about upholding economic prosperity, because there's an economic value of information to the nation. And so we're sort of catching up with that sort of thinking. Finally, the last plank in our digital continuity theme, when I was talking about the culture, how do we make sure that records are being created properly, diligently, and what are we doing about getting that information culture inculcated throughout the CSO? So we're not being so process-centric, we're becoming more info-centric. What we're doing there is an approach to, and I call it professionalise the civil service, but what I'm trying to say is if any organisation, if you have a chief financial officer, you would expect that person to be a certified, practising accountant or some sort of certification. If you have a legal advisor in your organisation, you would expect them to have a legal qualification. Well, having just gone through why the information, preservation of information is so vital for the prosperity, sustainability of public service and national prosperity, why is it that we entrust these, we're not applying similar regime to the people in charge of something as precious as the information assets of the organisation. So the final part of our Digital Continuity 2020 policy platform is by the year 2020, there will be, within each organisation, certified records managers meeting our standards of certification, and that this capability matrix, which you can't really see there, but I can't zoom in on just yet, that these professional standards have been observed as part of the corporate governance and information governance framework of every institution. So that we have the same level of diligence and duty and oversight and scrutiny on information as we do on people assets, and financial assets and property assets. Not too much to ask, but it's something that we must do. And just coming over here, I was interested in international developments, and I'm not sure. I mean, there might be some discussion about this in terms of through the Canadian system, if similar things are being done. But I do notice that in the US that NARA had put out as part of his presidential directive that there will be these certified officers in each organisation. And they will have attended training and been certified by NARA to actually perform those functions. And that's something which we are quite definite about in the Australian system. We've got to do it. And so they're the planks, if you like. They are the policy responses that we've come up with these challenges of the government. So it's really, the take-away messages there are that e-government is a major opportunity, and it is a very fast-moving opportunity, and it's being carried along, by and large, by the technology sector. I don't mind that. As a former CIO myself, that's what technology is all about. It's about increasing productivity. It's about propelling us all forward. As I said, technical obsolescence, love it. Nothing's better than a new gadget. I love it. Brilliant. Every week, bring me a new PC on the desk and I'll, willingly suffer through all the software bugs, etc. But what we have to do is have a seat at that table of the government discussions. We have to have a seat at the policy development table, and we have to be a key part of those information policy development discussions to make sure that e-government is taking us forward into the future. It's not just achieving one more shift onto a new technical platform, which will become obsolete 3 years from now. This is actually going to transform the way that we are all governed and the experience that we all have as citizens in an e-government. And the success is underpinned by high value records, reliable, authentic, reusable, accessible records. And so all that is adding up to say that we do want to get real information governance embedded as a critical part of corporate governance in every organisation, rewarded, recognised as part of that, to keep things digital, to encourage this long-term value and reusability of information and achieve that cultural change across all of the civil service to make sure that people value themselves for the knowledge they create and the way in which they can use knowledge to add value and deliver better policies, better public services. And this does come through, from my point of view, this information immortality as opposed to obsolete, perishable information. So thank you very, very much, and I'll be pleased to take questions. Thank you.